Well, it's 11:01. We probably need to get started. If you can work your way in and grab a seat. Welcome to Keys. Can you believe it's October? It's like, where did July go? Except maybe it melted. You should get your tree up now because Christmas is going to be here before you know it. And I think, where's Gary? Gary, do you have your Thanksgiving tree up yet? Does everybody know that Gary puts a Thanksgiving tree up and then he just changes the ornaments as the season progresses? So you have a tree up all year long? Fun. Yeah, if you're not, Sadie will tell you. So I want to give Tom Jackson as much time as possible. I'll save our announcements for after he's done. And what we have to look forward to is shepherd's pie. So make sure that you don't go I don't think so, but lunch is served around noon, so I just whetted their appetites to what they can expect. So
I mentioned a culinary treat from Scotland, so.
There you go.
Give me the high sign and I'll start talking.
Yeah, so Tom has been here many times, and he does all kinds of things and comes in. Yeah, 42 shows he has, and I have the whole list. You can find it online, and have him come to your next birthday party as your favorite piece of history. But Tom is here with us today. The history of Scotland, you probably could guess. And Tom, we're glad you're here. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to hand. Hello, everybody. I like to move around a little bit so you can see my beautiful knees. I've lost about 25 pounds in the past year or so. I get into suits that I bought in the 90s when I was practicing law. So I feel pretty good about my knees now and, losing all this weight. Well, I'm going to talk to you about one of the most important places in the world. It's amazing that Scotland is one of those tiny little countries. It's about the size of South Carolina and only has a population of about 5 million people, plus or minus, but it's had a profound impact on the world for about 500 years. It's really pretty amazing, and I'm going to go into some of this. How many of y'all have never seen me perform before? Oh, good, I've got a bunch of rookies. Okay, well, I have to make this disclaimer. There's no such thing as boring history. They're just boring historians. And happily for you and me and my bank account, I am not one of them. So everybody relax. You're going to laugh, you're going to cry. Just don't throw anything at me, but I begin. What comes to your mind about Scotland? Well, men in kilts. I mean, if you've ever seen them. That is right. That's exactly right. Give the lady a Cupid doll. Now, men in kilts who are just ordinary men going to some Scottish reception. By the way, how many of you all know Andrew Morrison? He may be a member here. I don't know. He's a big, tall, handsome guy, silver-haired. I knew him when he had black hair. He's still about this tall, though. Andrew Morrison is, by the way, he's a resident, a long-time domiciliary of San Antonio, Texas. He married one of the Brundage girls. He's also Viscount Dunrossel. His dad died a few years ago, and he finally, well, I've got some good news and some bad news. Dad died, but now I'm Viscount Dunrossel. Okay. Now, we also think of men playing bagpipes, either in civilian attire with those big, beautiful sporrans. By the way, this is a sporran. This is sort of an everyday sporran, the little pouch here, because these things don't have pockets. And, of course, on the right, there's a Highlander from one of the Highland regiments blasting away on his bagpipes. And I sort of tease Scotland a little bit because I admire them so much, and my name is Thomas Morrison Jackson, and I'll show you my clan tartan, a modern green tartan. And I'm very proud of my Scottish heritage. And anyone who has any Scottish blood in them should be too, because they helped make the world a much, much, much better place, because if it hadn't been for one Scotsman in particular, we wouldn't be here. There's a whole line of events, and some of you may know about this. The reason for the bagpipes, well, for entertainment, or to inspire Scottish troops to march well and fight bravely, because it is heroic music. Anyone who doesn't like bagpipe music is a heathen, as far as I'm concerned. It's to intimidate enemy troops before the battle. In 1991, one of the Scottish regiments that were driving in armored personnel carriers and tanks in the middle of the night to attack the Iraqis had their stereo systems all playing bagpipe music. It was scaring the hell out of the Iraqis. All they could see out there was night, and then this skirl of bagpipe from 5 miles away, and then their tanks started blowing up. So it works. It's a one way to gather the clans. Play your bagpipes, and you'll either gather them or drive them away, depending upon how well you play. And another way to gather the clans, by the way, is something reminiscent of a very unfortunate organization in the United States, the KKK. The Scots, if they wanted to gather the clans, they'd go up to one of the many hills in the Highlands, plant a cross, and set it alight. And you could see the thing from miles away. That means y'all come. So there's something we need to talk to you about, or we're going to go to war with the English, which is their traditional enemies, if not the clan on the other side of the glen. I mean, there was a lot of internecine fighting between one Scottish clan and another, but I'm not going to go into that in any great detail. But one other thing that we know about Scotland, they invented golf. God knows why. I have some theories about this. It's another form of physical exercise other than playing the bagpipes, which really tests your lung power, or fighting the English army, which was very rigorous too. But I think the fundamental reason that they invented bagpipes is to avoid performing their wives' honey-do lists on the weekends. Now, this is the Scottish thistle, their national flower. It's on all the little emblems if you go to Scotland or you buy any Scottish shop. Why is the thistle there? Well, a long time ago, a few centuries ago, the Vikings were trying to invade Scotland. And there were some Scots up at the top of a hill, and the Vikings had landed on the shore, and there was a big cliff, and the Vikings were trying to sneak up and attack this Scottish army, but some Viking reached out and grabbed hold of a thistle with his hand, cried out in pain, it alerted the Scots, and then they slaughtered the Vikings. So they've honored the thistle with that emblem on Scotland. And of course, there's also the cross of St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland. And he's also the namesake of an American president, well, two actually, Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson, which is part of the flag of the United Kingdom. The red cross is the cross of St. George. That's the English cross. The blue with a white background, of course, you can spot, is the cross of St. Andrew. And the red diagonal cross is the cross of St. Patrick. That was the third cross added to the Union Jack. And of course, when you think, how many of y'all have been to Scotland? Okay, lots of you, great. Well, of course you went to, don't tell me you didn't go to Edinburgh Castle. Edinburgh. We say Edinburgh here, but we're in Texas. And of course, the map of Scotland, the dark green area is the Scottish Highlands. And the light green just below it is the lowlands. And there's a big difference topographically. The lowlands are not so hilly and craggy and rocky and far more arable, meaning you can grow crops or livestock in it. But the Highlands are the real attention getter. If you go to Scotland and don't go to the Highlands, you've had a really bad tour group operator, because if you don't go up there, that's the most beautiful part of Scotland. And the islands are beautiful. The Atlantic coast is great. The ancestral home of the Morrisons was Lewis Island, just not far from Skye. But here's a picture of typical a little glen with some mountains for the Highlands. Here's another really great picture that I found with Highlands with a loch and a homestead, a crofter's shack down there. And of course, when you think of lochs, what loch comes to mind? Loch Ness, of course. Loch Ness, and there's Urquhart Castle in the foreground. Urquhart, what a cool name. I mean, the Scots have such cool names. I think they're great. There are over 31,000 freshwater lochs in Scotland. You can't swing a dead cat without falling in a loch. I mean, small ponds, medium-sized ponds. Loch Ness is 21 miles long. It's a great big place. And there are 100 sea lochs that communicate with either the Irish Sea, the North Sea, or the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, what do you think about when you think of Loch Ness? Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. You know, all the great advertising agencies must have had a Scotsman as their founding member, the creator of the business, because this is the biggest public relations coup in history, letting you believe that there's an ancient aquatic dinosaur swimming around in this Scottish lake. I hate to burst her bubble, but it's a myth. But it's a good myth. In 565 AD, St. Columba, who was an Irishman, who was sent over to Scotland to convert the Scots to Christianity, and believe me, it was a struggle, so purportedly saved a man from Nessie. Well, maybe it happened and maybe it didn't, but scientists and tourists have been flocking up there for hundreds of years trying to get a glimpse of Nessie. I mean, they've got the advertising on the cups and the hats and, you know, T-shirts and all this stuff about the Loch Ness Monster. And there have been some unusual sightings, but they can't really prove that the creature even exists. But according to archaeologists and geologists, it doesn't, because the loch got closed off long before the dinosaurs went extinct, which would have included big creatures like this. But anyway, it's still kind of fun to think about. And of course, how many of you ladies or gentlemen have Scottish woolens? Me too. I bought several great, beautiful, I've had many, many beautiful Harris tweed sport coats in my life. The only downside is when I lost 20 pounds, none of them fit anymore, which I'm not happy about. But they get it from the black-faced Scottish sheep, which they've had there for a very long time. So the woolen industry is a huge industry, and it is thriving. The Scots, and it makes sense because Scotland in the wintertime is a very cold, rainy, can be snowy, sleety. It's a tough place to live. So it's a good thing that sheep would thrive in that part of the world. Now, one other thing. Have you all ever been to a ceilidh, Scottish party? Well, one thing they do is they serve this. How many of y'all have had haggis? Okay, keep your hands up. How many of y'all like haggis? All the hands go down. Okay. Well, there are a couple of masochists in the group too. For those of you who don't know what haggis is, they cut open a sheep. The Scots cut open a sheep, remove the stomach, remove the other internal organs. They chop up the kidneys, the liver, the heart, pancreas, whatever else they want to make. Chop it up, add barley to it, whatever spices might be available. Maybe some rosemary, which would not be a bad idea, salt, pepper if they've got it. Stuff it into a sheep's stomach, tie it off, as you see it's knotted at each end, and boil it. And let me tell you, it's got a distinct flavor. And there's even the address to the haggis with Robert Burns, if you've ever been to a Burns night dinner. And I make a big deal of it. But I know one sure cure for the flavor of haggis: Scotch whiskey, which was originally distilled 2 years after Columbus sailed across the ocean blue by those very enterprising Scottish monks. They knew what they were doing. You know, once people learned about fermentation and distillation, it didn't take long for them to, expand their territories and tastes. And there's Highland Scotch that's a little brighter. It's less peaty than the island Scotch, but Glenlivet's it's probably the most famous Scotch in the world. But there are about 300 different types of Scotch sold in the world too. And these major wine and liquor distributors have every one of them. So you really can go through a lot. But the reason Scotch was invented, to get the taste of haggis out of your mouth. And believe me, I was at a Burns night dinner about 25 years ago, and we had a lot of Scotch to drink that night because they served us haggis. I mean, Now, I'm going to go into a little Scottish history. I'm wearing as close to a great kilt as I could figure out. And this is the great kilt. It's basically a great big piece of wool cloth, and you literally have to put it down on the ground, pleat the center of it. You know what a pleat is? You fold it over, you lay down on it, and beneath the cloth, there's a belt. You wrap the thing around you and then tie the belt off. You need help to put on a great kilt, which might have induced people to have big families, so there's somebody there who can help you get dressed. But it repels water. Of course, it's made of wool, heavy wool, because it rains, it keeps you warm, you can sleep in it. It's a one-piece garment that's all you need. You can do whatever chores you can, if you're not protecting yourself from the rain or the cold or heavy winds or any combination of those, you can wrap it around yourself as a blanket, sleep in it, work in it, do whatever you want to. But this is the traditional Scottish kilt with his sporran there hanging from his waist. But this is the modern kilt. This is the one you see if you see any pipe bands. This is the wee kilt, not the great kilt, which is a lot cooler. And I'm just not, my tartan looks great, but I don't know, I wouldn't wear it that much. But these didn't come along as far as specific assignations to particular clans until the 18th century. They don't go that, whatever cloth you could find before then, whether you're a Mackenzie or a MacDonald or whomever, you just put on whatever it was, and you couldn't spot them as being members of a particular clan until this assignation came in. Now, there's an old Scottish joke that I've got to tell you, and it's a bit suggestive, but it's not blue. There's this English nanny, nice young 20-something-year-old girl, and she's on a train. This is back in Victorian England, about 1880s, and she's on her way up to be a nanny for a Scottish lord at this big manor up in the Highlands. And she's sitting in there in the third class, which is all she can afford, and out of nowhere, this old Scotsman sits down right in the same car right across from her, going on the train up to Scotland. And she's reading this book about everything you've wanted to know about Scotland. Because she's English, born and bred, not particularly well educated, but she's pleasant. She's been trained to be a nanny. They've hired her. She's going to make a good living. And after a while, she can't help but seeing this guy, and he's sitting right across from her. And she says, "Excuse me, sir, but is there anything worn under your kilt?" And the old Scotsman sort of bristles up. And he says, "Worn? Certainly not. Everything under my kilt is in perfect working condition." I just love that story. So here's the modern Morrison green. I've got a tie. We've even got a vest. It's just great. But this is modern Scotland, pretty much, in the recent few hundred years. I found out that early humans were in Scotland 13,000 years ago. Back when the British Isles were part of the European continent, and then there was a seismic shift, and then thank God they're off, they're not part of the European continent joined. That's changed history a lot too, that they haven't been, to their advantage, to their great advantage. Well, it was the Scots up there in the far north in the blue, the Britons in the red area, which is England and Wales, and the Irish over there across the Irish Sea. And this was the people in that part of the world about 900 BC, circa 900 BC. And they're around the 1st century BC, the century just before Christ was born, the Julius Caesar, the famous Roman general who had visions of becoming king, which were cut short, he invades England but fails to conquer them. So he withdraws the Roman army. But about 100 years later, under a different emperor, the Romans reinvade England and they defeat the English tribes. And the Roman army was the best trained army in the ancient world that were controlling Europe. They built forts, they established all sorts of towns, London, Manchester, York, Liverpool, you name it. They had a Bath, they built the baths, the spa there at Bath. And they were there for a few hundred years, till about the 5th century AD, because they were just part of the Roman Empire. But they had a specific name for those Scotsmen who were across the border there that they were trying to keep out of England, which was lush, pleasant farmland. You could raise crops. There was tin there. There was some wealth in England that the English liked that was useful to them. And it was a good trading point with Europe out to England. But these are the people that they had to try to fight, the Picts. How many of you seen people with tattoos in the last 5 minutes? We are tattoo crazy in this country. And I had a client, when I was practicing law for 30 years, I had a client about 25 years ago, about 30 years ago, in the tattoo business. I thought, this is never gonna last. Little did I know. But the Picts were called Picts because when the Romans were fighting them, they were usually fighting bare-chested, and they were covered with tattoos. And the basis for the word picture in going back to Latin as a base language is Pict. So the Romans called them Picts. And these people were very aggressive. I mean, they were tough as nails. They didn't have any armor. They had these relatively flimsy shields, long swords, and they were brave as lions too. But when they come up against the Roman army in any way, shape, or form, they'd usually get beaten because the Romans had better technology, better weapons, far more sophisticated weapons than they did, and the Picts were still a pain in their sides. So much so, not everybody's heard of Hadrian's Wall. That's the one on the lower portion there, down at the Scottish border with England. Hadrian decided to keep those pesky Picts out of England, so they built a wall that's 60 miles long, with forts about every mile or so. It was made of stone. Didn't really count, didn't really make any difference, but they couldn't keep these Picts from raiding into England, so during the reign of Marcus Antoninus, just 20 years later, they built another wall, a little narrower part up there, where the Firth of Forth is trying to, let's keep them caged up there. Didn't work that well either. I mean, the Picts would just go around it or go over it. So, it was an attempt by the Romans to control them, which really never worked out, just like the Romans really never were able to control the Germans either. So, in the 4th century, Christian missionaries start to come in trying to convert the Picts, like St. Columba. And a lot of these missionaries came from Ireland, which has had a very long history of saving Western civilization and the Bible, because when plagues were ravaging Europe, out there on this little tiny island that the Romans called Hibernia, the land of winter, was Ireland, and those Irish monks in their monasteries were busily, making manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, and copying the Bibles in Latin very meticulously, very painstakingly, and kept some of the teachings of the ancient history alive out in these monasteries in Ireland. So we really have to thank the Irish monks out there in this isolated part of the world for keeping all that alive while Europe had to suffer through the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages all the way to the 15th century. But St. Columba was accepted by the Picts by driving out the monster, supposedly. And in 843, the last Pictish king dies and is succeeded by Kenneth MacAlpin, king of the Scots, who unites the Picts with the Scots to fight who? The Danish and the Norwegian Vikings. Now, Morrison is a Viking, is a Viking name. And my Morrison ancestors came from Norway. He must have been the world's worst Viking because he shipwrecked off the Outer Hebrides and had to swim to shore. And one of the clan badges is a hand coming up out of the water. One of them is holding a knife. The other one's holding a piece of wood. And when I looked at the clan badge for the first time, I didn't know what it really meant, but I guessed it meant keep paddling, boys, after they crashed onto the rocks in the Outer Hebrides. But anyway, they thrived. They landed and stayed in Lewis for a very long time. They had a spat with the McGregors and had to leave, but that's something else. By the 10th century, the 900s, Pictish lands had become the kingdom of Alba, and Gaelic, or Erse, becomes the new language. And Pictish culture vanished except for those stone carvings, chiseling. You go and see these steles, these ceremonial columns. Some are small, some are fairly large, carving away with runes or scenes of animals or people doing something to be commemorated, or just swirls and designs illustrating something from Pictish culture. And you'll see it you probably saw it when you went up there, presumably, or it's in the British Museum if you went down to London. By the 5th century, there's this new era of invasion into the British Isles after the Roman occupation ends, because Rome is collapsing at the 5th century. In the mid-400s, Rome fell. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. It just had outlived its usefulness, and their neighbors were fed up with the Roman Empire, and they took over Rome. But a new group of people are now coming in, and these are pre-Viking. They're the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, and they come from northern Germany and Denmark, and they came in, and not just one big invasion like William the Conqueror. It was over the course of several years, and they really went to town. You can see they were coming over and going all the way up to the Firth of Forth. The Saxons and the Jutes were down in the south. The Angles took the lion's share of the British Isles as far as England and Scotland is concerned. And how did they get across there? Well, they came across in ships, obviously. But later on in the 8th century, now here's a really telling part, the Vikings start showing up. And the first place the Vikings attacked was a monastery at Lindisfarne that was a tidal island with a monastery on top of it. And the Vikings thought, that looks like an easy place to steal stuff. Because the monasteries back in the Middle Ages were the seats of learning, seats of education. Towns were growing up around them because the monks were there administering to the flocks religiously and culturally, taking care of whatever they needed to do in a worldly sense, with helping them in any way they could. There was agriculture thriving in these places, but the monasteries were also the source of great wealth, because these monasteries were making money. And what do you do when you get, what attracts a Viking? Silver, gold, art objects, anything of value at all. I don't care if it's a brass pot, they'll steal it. So they attacked Lindisfarne in 793. These are Norwegian Vikings, my people, going back a long, long time. Killed some of the monks, killed some of the people, took some of them hostages to make them slaves. The Vikings really weren't very nice people. They really weren't. And so that was the first attack by them. And here I am, by the way, if you want to hear more about the Vikings, there I am with my reindeer cape on, and both, with my Viking sword, authentic style sword. I even built a belt for it. There's my Viking axe. It's sharp as a razor. So if you want to hear something about the Vikings, please hire me during the cold times of the year. That is an actual reindeer rug that you can buy out at the Tandy Leather Works, and they're about $100. I turned it into a cape. And I tell you what, I was warm as toast testing it out one cold night last year. It was just great. So, and I'm going to talk to you just briefly about the Vikings, because this is all those areas where the blue lines are. Those are the areas where the Vikings explored. They were going all over Europe. The Vikings, as we know them, there are three Vikings from only three nations, Norway and Denmark, which are the ones who went westward and north. And the Swedish Vikings there on the Baltic coast, they basically went east into Western Russia and are establishing trade routes all over the place. So in 200 years, this is where the Vikings had gone, all the way to L'Anse-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland. They had settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and Canada. They were all over the British Isles. They were down there in Spain. They were in the Mediterranean. And these were the seafaring, adventurous, risk-taking entrepreneurs. Somebody once described pirates as maritime entrepreneurs, which is exactly what they are. Hi, we're going to sail around, and if we find some easy target, we're going to attack it. We're going to steal whatever we can, including the ship if we have to, and go on our merry way and get rich. Well, Vikings were maritime entrepreneurs who eventually turned into legitimate traders, T-R-A-D-E-R-S. They had things of value like amber and furs and dried fish and things that were very valuable that the other peoples in Europe and as far away as Turkey and the Mideast and the Eastern Mediterranean wanted. So they were going all over the place as signified in this map. By the way, there's a very prominent person that you read about in the news just about every day. He's the current dictator of Russia. His name is Vladimir Putin, for those of you who've been living on another planet and never heard of the guy. And he's blonde-haired, blue-eyed, vicious. He is the quintessential version of a Viking. Because if he wants it and you own it, he's going to take it. That's why they've been attacking the Ukrainians, hopefully who will win. But the interesting thing about it, when the Swedish Vikings came in their Viking ships across the Baltic Sea and they went up those rivers from coming out of traditional Russia into the Baltic Sea, they could row their ships up these big, nice, broad rivers. And they didn't have to have Viking ships have a very shallow draft, so you could go up virtually any river without scraping the bottom. And they came into this area in Western Russia and established a settlement. And the people there in that area looked at them and they called them Rus, R-U-S. The men who row. They're rowing their Viking ships up the rivers. Well, they stayed and established a place called Kiev, or Kiev if you're a Russian. So Western Russia was settled by the Vikings. And they have stayed there ever since. So that's where we get Russia, from the Rus. And early Scottish kings for hundreds of years, you probably read about or seen movies about there. Of course, I mentioned Kenneth MacAlpin, he founded the nation of Scotland in the 9th century. There was Constantine II, who held off the Vikings, which was no small order. The nice thing, one of the best things about Scotland is that it wasn't particularly agriculturally rich. And guess how much silver and gold they had? 0. Did they have any copper? No. Did they have any mineral wealth in Scotland? No. There wasn't any. There weren't emeralds, rubies, diamonds. No, none of that stuff. So the Vikings, the whole reason, the raison d'etre for going someplace is that you could lay your hands on the wealth of that area. And there really wasn't much unless you were just out, sheep stealing, which they did, of course. Of course, there was Robert the Bruce, and there were lots of Roberts, actually, and they defeated the English at Bannockburn in 1314. And Pope John the 22nd, way back there in the 14th century, named him the King of Scotland, and all the descendants of Robert the Bruce are officially kings of Scotland. They are in the direct line of him by blood. And James IV of Scotland was the granddad of James VI, and I'm going to go into some of the Stuarts here in a second. And James VI of Scotland was the King of Scotland from 1567 to 1603. And I'm going to get into him in a little bit more detail. But it's interesting, when after Queen Elizabeth died, the English aristocracy was saying, well, look, we've had all these problems with successions of kings ever since Henry VIII. There were 2 monarchs before Elizabeth got named. The other 2 died, and then she finally became queen, and she was on the throne for a very long time. When she died, they thought, God, who do we get now? England went from being Catholic to Church of England to Protestant. Who do we get now? Well, they looked across the border, and the Kingdom of Scotland was its own kingdom with their own king. It was James VI. And they said, I say, would you like to be King of England? And James said, it suits me just fine. I'll be glad to do it. You have to call me King James I of England, though. He said, no problem, come on down. So they crowned him King of England. He was King of England and King of Scotland simultaneously when they crowned him in 1603 as King of England. That is the genesis of calling the United Kingdom, the UK. It wasn't that being a King of Scotland really wasn't that great a job when you think of longevity. If you had a life insurance policy, it was going to be cashed in pretty quickly because from 843 to 1567, they had 42 kings and 2 queens. These guys were either being killed in battle, died of disease, poisoned by a rival, something. They weren't living very long. Very few died in their bed of old age. And there were 12 kings that were murdered. And we're not going to even go into Macbeth and Macduff and all that stuff. I mean, there were even more. But here's a flag that you may not be that familiar with, which harkens back all the way to the 13th century. That's not the official flag of Scotland. This is the royal standard of Scotland. It's got a rampant lion on it. That's what rampant means, with one of its paws up and one of its legs up. And those symbols around on those two stripes, they represents the old alliance between Scotland and France, the little fleur-de-lis, because they had a political alliance at one time that continued down through history. But if you want to think of, if you can feel free, if you want to express your displeasure, if you know anything about Scotland, to boo the next person, boo or hiss the next person I'm about to show you. King Edward I. Boo, boo, horrible man. The problem for the Scots was, they had a dead king and they had to replace him. And there was a power vacuum between the various Scottish families as to who was going to succeed this dead Scottish king. There was John Comyn, who had a claim. There was the Bruce family with Robert the Bruce, who had a claim. This was back in the 13th century, around the time of William Wallace and his uprising against the English. And they made this terrible mistake. They asked King Edward I of England to be sort of the umpire, is to decide who the next king of Scotland was going to be. And he says, surprise kids, it's going to be me. And since he had the biggest army in the British Isles, they could just go, what? You can't do that. Yes, I do. I have a really big army. And he was just horrible to them. I mean, it was oppressive. Edward the Longshanks, he was a big, tall guy, brutal as hell. He'd gone on crusades, very well educated, smart, utterly ruthless. And he got the nickname Malleus Scotorum, the hammer of the Scots. I mean, just horrible man. How many of you all saw Braveheart with Mel Gibson? And with Patrick McGowan playing. It was a great movie. There's some historical imperfections in the movie that I'll get to in just a second. But anyway, so there was this big power struggle, and him taking over Scotland triggered the Scottish Wars of Independence that went along for a long time, from the late 13th century into the early 14th. And then, of course, there's William Wallace, who resented the heck out of them. And he, while all the other Scottish nobilities were all chattering away each other and stamping their feet and arguing with each other as what they're going to do about the English, Wallace said, well, we've got to defend Scotland, so he raised an army, because he was a charismatic. His dad was sort of a minor noble, not top rank, but said, we've got to fight these guys. And he raised an army. They were very successful for a limited period of time, and he is praised up and down, and rightly so, so much so that Randall Wallace, who produced the movie called Braveheart, and he was the rebellion's first leader. And the English were William Wallace was fairly well educated, and he was defeating the English with hit-and-run tactics. They beat them at Stirling Bridge. I mean, it was just driving the English crazy. But there were political rivalries within Scotland to try to get rid of these guys. And they actually betrayed him to the English, which is portrayed in the movie Braveheart. Now, Mel Gibson, back in 1995, won the Oscar for portraying William Wallace. Michaelach, it's in Scottish, with his big claymore sword. And there's one problem with this picture, and one problem with the movie, which was confirmed to my thinking at a documentary produced some years later by a bunch of Scottish historians. William Wallace never wore a kilt. He was a lowland Scot, not a Highland Scot. He wore trousers, never wore a kilt. But the producers thought Mel Gibson in a dress would be really sexy, and everybody's going to come to this thing. And they were right. It was a huge hit. You know, the love scene with his girlfriend, soon to be his wife, when she's wrapping the great kilt around him, everybody's, oh, isn't this great? So he did okay by it, made a bunch of money. The movie was extremely possible, but just gives you another idea. You don't learn history by watching movies. You read books or well-produced documentaries of some sort. And here he is, a successor to William Wallace after many years. The Bruce was actually sort of an outlaw for a while, and Robert the Bruce finally beat the English at Bannockburn in 1314. And here's his famous equestrian statue. The English sent one of their champions out to meet Bruce in sort of hand-to-hand, trial by combat. Hubert de Bohun, this Norman knight, went out there to do battle with Robert the Bruce. Robert had this really nice battle axe. He hit him in the head with it, cleaved his head open, won that little engagement. Well, that was, he went on to fame and fortune. But over the centuries, the English and the Scottish were fighting each other. I mean, the Scots really hated the English, and rightly so. The English wanted to extend their territory, wanted to build the British Empire. But by 1320, the Scots were petitioning the Pope at the time to recognize Scottish independence from England. And it was called the Declaration of Arbroath. And I'll read it without a Scottish accent. But this is the gist of what they were telling the Pope. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself, which is probably the best encapsulation of what the Scots have stood for centuries. Independent-minded. They may have squabbles with their neighbors in the next glen, but at least it's Scot on Scot. But if there's anyone who's attacking Scotland, generally speaking, they will band together because they were hating foreign interference into their affairs. They would fight to the death. And they brought that same attitude from Scotland into the New World when later on Scottish emigres left Scotland and came to Canada and the United States. And the United States was far better for that. But eventually the Scots finally get their independence, and there's a treaty with the English in 1328. The English crown finally recognized Scotland as an independent kingdom, which is good. I'm just touching on some of these things. Now, the Scots were going back to the Middle Ages, were very big on education. They had more universities sooner than the English did, which is kind of surprising because they weren't nearly as wealthy. When you think of Oxford and Cambridge, you're going on Eton, going back to 1440. Well, the Scots had these universities at St. Andrews in 1413, University of Glasgow, 1451, Aberdeen in 1495, and Edinburgh in 1582. These were centers of learning. Primarily, they were teaching the clergy and they were teaching lawyers. And delving into the sciences, because they were very intellectual people. They really wanted to learn something more and more, which is sort of in the DNA molecule of Scots. They're very curious. They want to learn as much as they can. Now, of course, England's most famous queen is Mary, Queen of Scots, which she had a little problem with her cousin down in England, Queen Elizabeth I. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail, but Mary, who had a legitimate claim to the English throne when Henry VIII died, was deprived of that because there were 3 children born by Henry VIII through different queens who all ascended to the throne, and Mary was left out in the cold. And Mary was still a Catholic. So with all this, when Henry VIII created the Anglican Church, the Church of England, that put down the card that Catholicism isn't going to be tolerated here anymore. I am the head of the English Church in Henry VIII's eyes. Of course, there were some ups and downs in that. He eventually died. His son, Edward VI, takes over. He doesn't live very long, but he's a Protestant. Then when he dies, Henry's sister, who's a Catholic, Mary Tudor, takes over, and she hated Protestants, killed about 300 of them. She died, and then who's left in this pecking order of who can possibly be a recognized, legitimate offspring of Henry VIII? Elizabeth I. But up there in Scotland, Mary, who had been married off to become Queen of France years before, thought, and when her husband, the King of France, died, she had to go back to Scotland because she was still the anointed Queen of Scotland. So she had a claim, she thought. It was never going to happen because Elizabeth didn't want her to be on the throne. Elizabeth was a Protestant, dyed in the wool. She was concerned about the Catholic and the papal influences taking over England. She was worried about the Irish. She was worried about the English Catholics and Scottish Catholics and the Spanish and the French, all of whom were Catholics too. So England was held very tightly in grip by Elizabeth I until she died in 1603. Ironically, irony of ironies, when Elizabeth died, the English aristocracy, mostly Protestants, say, Queen Bess is dead, who do we get to be the new King of England? Well, they only have to look north up to the Kingdom of Scotland, because sitting up there is King James VI of Scotland. They said, would you like the job? He said, sure. I'll be glad to be King James I of England. And he took it, and he was King of England from 1603 to 1625. Ironically, his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, whose death warrant was signed and executed against his mother because Mary, Queen of Scots, was plotting the overthrow of Elizabeth I and to turn England back into a Catholic country once again. So Elizabeth's would have never guessed in a million years that a Queen of Scotland and a former Queen of France son was going to take over for her as the new King of England. And this starts the Stuart family regime in Scotland. And they only had a few of them. They went from James I to Queen Anne, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. But anyway, it's important from the standpoint of exploration and the growth of America, the British colonies in North America, that James I was very ambitious too. He wanted to start the Jamestown colony. And James, being that canny Scottish businessman and king, gave the people of England who wanted to go into trading and searching around the world and creating colonies and getting rich, he said, I'll sell you a license. I mean, James telling these investors, I'll sell you a license to give you permission to leave the British Isles, risk your ship, your crews, whatever cargo you're carrying, and you go out and settle in places that I'm going to give you an exclusive license to without discussing it with the people who might already be there. And if it works, great. It doesn't cost the English crown a penny, but if you come back with all sorts of valuable items like crops or jewels or cotton or tobacco or silk or whatever, the English crown gets a cut of that. What a great deal for the monarchy. So they did that. So in 1607, these merchants decided to go with the Virginia company, who bought the license from the king so they could leave legally, go over there. And it's a tough going there in Jamestown. It took them years and years and years, and all sorts of colonists dying off, and they were fighting the Indians until they struck gold when they started growing tobacco, and then cotton, and then that first permanent English colony there in the New World, Jamestown, really took off. Then in 1620, for the same reason, religious oppression, the Pilgrims, those separatists who had their own little sect, decided that they'd left England to go to Holland and were there for some years, and then they thought, we have to leave Holland, but we just want to pass through England and go to the New World so we can practice our religion the way we want to. Sure enough, some merchant adventurers said, hi, we'll give you passage over there for free. You just have to work for us 4 days out of the week. You can rest on Sunday, and then 2 days you can do whatever you want to. And they took them up on it. The problem is, when the Pilgrims started so late, and it's too involved to tell you about, when the Pilgrims tried to get down to Virginia where they were bound to, they couldn't get down there. They had to stop in Massachusetts. And part of the deal was they were supposed to be delivered down in Virginia. So they told the ship captain, hey, you're not taking us where we were supposed to be dropped off. We're on our own now. Bye. We don't owe anybody anything. So those pilgrims there in Massachusetts either sank or swam on their own initiative, and they did pretty well. But with this, as I said before, with the creation of cotton coming into British North America and very strong tobacco from the Caribbean being brought up there, the wealth started flowing into the British Empire. From James I onward, huge amounts of wealth in cotton, tobacco, all sorts of other raw materials flowing back to the mother country, to the British Isles. It was just enormous. And one thing, parenthetically, when they found out about cotton and they started raising tobacco, very strong tobacco, high nicotine levels, James I found out about this plant that you either can cut up and put in a pipe and smoke it, or sniff it in the form of snuff. James I pegged the dangers of tobacco right off the bat over 400 years ago. He called tobacco the scurvy weed. And he was right. I mean, God knows all the people who've suffered from the various forms of cancer caused by tobacco products. It's just terrible. But after James died, he's succeeded by his son, James I, who's a Catholic. And, Charles I, who succeeds his dad, James I. Charles is kind of a spoiled brat. I mean, he wants to do what he wants to do all the time, and he ran afoul of the English Parliament, and the parliamentary system had been around for hundreds of years. And Charles wanted to do what he wanted to do, and a war broke out between King Charles I, the Stuart king, the second Stuart king, and the English Parliament, and they had the English Civil War that lasted from 1642 to 1651. And Charles is the only English monarch who was accused of treason, tried for treason, convicted, and beheaded. They chopped his head off in 1649, which is a pretty satisfactory way of dealing with the leader of a country who really oversteps the bounds. There's going to be zero recidivism if you get your head chopped off. But the English Civil War was just horrific, and it frankly was Charles's fault. And it cost them a fortune in lives and men and material. The casualty figures for the deaths in battle and the deprivation and the starvation and malnutrition were horrible. And it was all through the UK. Well, eventually, Charles, as I said, was captured. He was beheaded. And then it brought in Oliver Cromwell, number 9 on your list, who was a Puritan. Puritan in the most puritanical sense of the word. In other words, nobody's going to have any fun so long as I'm the Lord Protector of England. No dancing, no singing, no drinking. He shut down all the pubs. Nothing's going to make a Scotsman or an Englishman madder than not being able to go to get his friendly pint. And he also shut down the brothels, which is probably a good thing. But after a while, the people got fed up with this. Cromwell dies. So what do? They restore the monarchy. Who do they look to? The Stuart clan. Okay, let's bring Charles I's son and restore the monarchy in 1660. And they had a deal with Charles, look, don't go crazy. Don't spend all this money. Don't just be, thinking the divine right of kings is going to let you do whatever you want to do, because you have to answer to Parliament, because it's got to pass Parliament before any money is raised or distributed. Well, he doesn't do the right thing, obviously. And they'd go through another succession of kings, King James I, now and then his grandson, King James II, and it's just been back and forth and back and forth. King James VII of Scotland's King James II of England, and he's run out of the country. And what do the English do then? They go and find a Dutch Protestant, William of Nassau, William of Orange, to say, hi, how would you like to be king? And he goes, well, okay. And he's got a wife. It's William and Mary. And they're both, they're king and queen of England. After the Stuarts, they think, are gone forever. The remaining Stuarts have been banished. They're living in France or in Italy. But 3 Jacobite is the Latin name for James. So the Jacobite rebellions or attempted rebellions were called the Jacobites, who wanted to get the Stuart family back into power. And they had 3 rebellions starting in 1689, 1715, 1719, and 1745. Well, the last big one that you probably already know about was one led at least by, in name only, by the latest Stuart king, Bonnie Prince Charlie. And it was a disaster for the Scots. He came over from France. He was snide, he was spoiled, he was young, he'd never been in battle, and he had great aspirations about becoming King of England again. Well, the only problem was that some of the Scottish clans didn't like him very much, and some not only didn't like him, they were on the English side of the battles that were being fought between the Jacobite armies, trying to get him reinstated as the latest of the Stuart kings of England, and the people who are down there in London by now, who are the German kings, the Hanoverian kings. Germans, starting in the early 1700s after Queen Anne, they brought in a German, full German, King George I. And the British royal family today is derived from that same Germanic blood. There's very little English blood in any of the British royal family at the top tier. The last sort of inroads with putting some Englishness into this Germanic bloodline was Princess Di, because she was a Spencer. She wasn't Germanic at all. So this 1745, he arrives. He's trying to get this thing organized. He's trying to take over the country. The problem is they had this huge battle at Culloden in Scotland, Culloden Moor in 1746. And there are these brave Scotsmen with their kilts and their basket-hilted claymores and their tarred shields, and some of them have billhooks and fairly crude weapons, going against a professional English army who's well-equipped, knew how to fight, and had them outgunned. And here, and I'll show you something that the famous Highland Charge. Would you quake in terror, if not run away altogether, if people looking like that were running at you with a great big sword and a little bitty shield, screaming at you? This was probably the creation of the rebel yell, that high-pitched wail as you're running headlong into the enemy. And it doesn't matter whether it's cannon or muskets or whatever they've got, you're going to do this because you are so crazed. This is also dates back to the berserkers, those Vikings who would do the same sort of tactic, just run at you screaming and yelling, because if they died in battle, they're going to heaven under Viking religious practices. Not a problem. You have to die with a sword in your hand if you want to go to Valhalla and have a great time for eternity. Well, the Scots tried it. The problem is they ran into English artillery. Not good. Artillery versus infantry, artillery is going to win just about every time. And the British also, they'd been fighting the Scots so long, they invented something really important. On the end of their muskets, they had bayonets. 18 inches of cold steel about that long and a triangular shape, so if they stabbed a Scotsman, he was going to bleed to death, if not kill him outright. And the Scottish clans, this is from an old woodcut that was colorized at the time, the Scottish clans just got decimated in this big final battle. And the results of the Battle of Culloden, a disaster for the Scots, not only for their army, but Scottish culture. Prince Charlie had to flee back to France. And the English Parliament passed the Acts of Prohibition in 1746, shortly after the Battle of Culloden, that disarmed all the Highlanders. It crushed the clan system. It banned kilts and bagpipes. I mean, that's a really low blow. I mean, they didn't want anything that would rouse Scottish passions. And they created something called the Highland Clearances. They sent their troops into the Scottish Highlands and tore down the little shacks and huts of Scottish small farmers. I mean, they just destroyed them so they didn't have any place to live. The English did it with the Irish and the potato famine too. So they removed the Highlanders from Canada and sent them where could they possibly go and help to keep their culture alive in any way, shape, or form? Go west. Canada and the British colonies in North America. Canada and the British colonies in what became the United States of America. That was a huge benefit to Canada and the United States. And the Scots also had to be re-educated, stop being so Scottish. They, and telling a Scotsman not to be a Scotsman, good luck with that. And it ended once and for all the Stuart claim to the throne. Well, happily, there is a bright spot. After hundreds of years, the acts of prohibition were repealed. And when Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 after the death of King George IV, she married she was German. Victoria was pure German. Her parents were both of Germanic blood. German was her first language. When she said, "We are not amused," it was actually, "Wir are not amused." German, 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 and and they figure out, who can she possibly marry? Well, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was right there over in Europe, in Coburg, which was the nursery for future kings all over Europe. And she looks at him and goes, she just went, and even in her journal it says, "He's beautiful." This big, tall, handsome, well-educated, intellectual, loved to play music, physically fit, God. And she had to ask him for his hand in marriage. He couldn't ask her. It was strictly not protocol. He couldn't propose to her. She did to him, saying, "This is going to work out just fine." She was about that tall. He was about this tall. They had 9 kids. So they didn't have a distant relationship in any way, shape, or form. She was absolutely devoted to this guy. Well, the benefit to Scotland was this. Early in her reign, in the 1640s, they take a trip up to Scotland by cart, basically, fancy stagecoach. And they go up there and they see the Scottish Highlands and they go, "It's beautiful up here." And they stay in a very nice manor house, and they're treated very well by the Scots, and they're very polite back. And they just fall in love with Scotland. My God, the scenery and the heather. And we're riding horses, and we're picnicking in these beautiful areas with these vast expanses of gorgeous land. And they are really taking Scotland, hey, this might be a place that we should promote. Let's bring back the Scottish weaving industry and the Scottish whiskey production. Let's help the Scottish economy get back on its feet, because it's been intentionally deprived for all these years based upon what happened 100 years ago. And they do, and it helps boost the Scottish economy. And guess what also happens? All those English swells going, "Well, if it's good enough for Her Majesty, we're going to, Chauncey, we're going to have a house up there too. We're going to have some beautiful estate up in the Scottish Highlands. If we can't buy one, we'll build one." So there was this building boom, and anybody who was anybody, if they didn't have a lot of money, they just go on vacations to Scotland, and the tourism industry just took off like a rocket. They were putting cruise boats on big locks and taking people around, and restaurants were opening and small hotels, and it was just great. And eventually, as I said, Albert and Victoria had 9 kids. He bought Balmoral Castle and added greatly to it, and the English royal family has been going to Balmoral ever since the 1740s, including QE2 and, of course, Charles III. Because let's get away from the heat, let's get away from the noise, let's get away from the smells of London back when it was not a very pleasant place to live, and let's get away from the tourists. Let's go to Scotland. Let's get away from the American tourists in London. Let's go to Scotland. So that's what they do. And it was a huge win. And the Scots just love her. Scots were also in other important wars. Most importantly, as far from the American standpoint, is the American War of Independence. King George III had a really interesting nickname for the American Revolution that I think is going to amuse you even more so than it does the average audience. King George III called the American Revolution the Presbyterian War. You know why? Because his troops were going to be fighting a bunch of Scottish Highlanders who had been to America and had a big taste of freedom and were able to worship any way they wanted to, if you were a Presbyterian or a Baptist or a Catholic. Now, you had to go to those particular colonies to have all the full civil rights. You had to be an Episcopalian to vote in Virginia, for instance. There were 9 official religions in colonial America. But now these Presbyterian Scots whose ancestors were either oppressed by the English or they were driven out of Scotland by the English, had a chance to get their own back against the English. And they just didn't dislike the English. They hated their guts and livers. And they were the most faithful of all the colonial troops in George Washington's Continental Army. Because it was said of the Scots and the Scots-Irish, and there were a lot of them too who came to America in 3 successive waves over 2 different centuries. They said, you insult a Yankee, he'll sue you. You insult a mountain boy, meaning a Scotsman, he'll kill you. And there was also another saying about the Scots, they'd rather die than take a step back. I mean, they were that stubborn, they were that righteous, they loved liberty, they loved their independence, self-determination, going back to Declaration of Our Birth, and William Wallace, and we have to fight against oppression regardless of who it's from, but they made excellent soldiers. Scots are tough as nails. I mean, how can you not be tough as nails? You're a Pict, you're a Viking, and you hate the English. I mean, just the DNA of these people is going to be, you don't want to go to war with the Scots if you can help it. Now, the French learned that the hard way too in the Napoleonic Wars. There's a famous painting of the Scots Greys attacking at Waterloo with the Gordon Highlanders running alongside the horses, holding onto the stirrups of the horses of the Scots cavalry going into battle at the Battle of Waterloo. They get wiped out, but it's just this incredible battle. The Scots really distinguished themselves. About 20 years later, there was a Scottish influence at another place that you people probably know something about. It's called the Texas Revolution. Here are 4 veterans of the Texas Revolution who died defending the Alamo, of Scottish heritage. William Barrett Travis, the commander of the Alamo, after Jim Bowie got too sick and had to cede his authority to Travis. James Butler Bonham, one of Travis's old pals. David Crockett, another Scottish name. Jim Bowie, and many, many more. Because most of the people who came into the Republic of Mexico's territory, known as Texas, starting in 1821, most of the settlers were Scots-Irish. They were Scots-Irish, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic Vikings, culturally speaking, and they came into Texas. And others involved in the Texas Revolution of Scottish background: Sam Houston, David Burnett, Stephen F. Austin, the father of Texas. Scots. Plus there were Masons. All the leaders of the Texas Revolution from Houston on down were in the Masonic orders. A lot of Scots are, and that's great. The Scots also fought in the Crimean War in 1854 against the Russians. And the Scots, this is an example of they'd rather die than take a step back. There are Scottish regiments holding their positions in the face of a big Russian cavalry charge, and they didn't move. And the Russian horses had at least the good sense not to go into these bayonets. But the Scots just held the line. This is the thin red line tipped with steel. Brave as lions. And then we go on to World War I, and I love this line. The Germans on the Western Front, who were having to fight the Scottish regiments, wearing their kilts, of course, hated fighting these guys. I mean, they really did. The Germans feared these guys. And they had a nickname for the Scottish regiments in World War I. They called them the ladies from hell. Remember their kilts. And every Scottish regiment, I mean, even Winston Churchill called the Gordon Highlanders during World War II the finest regiment in the world. And he was right. Well, we're getting on to modern times, and I'm just about done. Scottish devolution. Scotland finally gets its own parliament. After the Act of Union in 1707, where the English and Scottish parliaments were merged, almost 300 years later, Scotland's got its parliament back in Edinburgh. And the Scots are celebrating all over the world. And there was a big parade in New York City in April of 1998. And I just happened to be in New York City with my wife tagging along for one of her convention groups, doing some cultural entertainment about Texas. And in April, the day that there was a big parade, guess who the parade grand marshal was? Sir Sean Connery. And before the parade gets, I was staying at a hotel on 55th Street and 7th Avenue. And I'd had an early lunch with my wife at the Carnegie Deli, not far from the hotel. And I had this gigantic pastrami sandwich and a big salty pickle and some, cream soda. And she went on to her Saturday afternoon meeting. I was thirsty. I was really thirsty. And I didn't know anything about the parade at all. I just heard somebody tuning up their bagpipes nearby, traveling through those buildings in New York City. And I looked down the street, and there's a guy with a kilt with his bagpipes, tuning them up and, testing out and it was a sign from God. He was standing right under a sign that says Connolly's Pub. And this was 12:30 on a Saturday afternoon, and I was thirsty. And I've been known to have a beer or two. And I go in there, and I'm dressed in my historic attire. I look like I stepped off the set of Lonesome Dove. At that time, I had my full beard grown and some 1870s, 1880s Texas cowboy with a big hat, all authentic attire, frock coat. And I opened the outer door, and like all the bars in New York, a lot of them are long and narrow because the real estate's so expensive. So I open up the outer door, sort of tip my hat to the piper, and he tips it back. And then I walk into the second door, and there's a landing there. And I look on this sea of Scotsmen dressed in their attire and their kilts, and the women were in their sashes and their brooches on, and the guys with pheasant feathers in their hats and Glengarrys and Balmoral bonnets. And I'm just standing there. And after a while, some of the people and the place was packed, and they were all drunk. They had all been drinking all morning because they were getting ready for the parade that was going to come right down the road in front of the bar. And I'm standing there, and after a while, one Scotsman said, "Would you look at that, looking at me?" And just sort of this wave of silence goes over the whole crowd. Even the bartenders were stopped pulling beer. They were looking at me. And I shout in this booming voice, "I'm Thomas Morrison Jackson. I'm a Scottish American from San Antonio, Texas." And there was this pause of a couple of seconds, and then they went, "Hooray!" So I just waded into these people, and I had a few Bellhaven ales with these people. A few. And after about 2 hours of drinking with these people, telling them what I was doing, and one lady said, "You look like the Duke of Argyll." I said, "I am the Duke of Argyll," because I put on somebody's Glengarry. "I am the Duke of Argyll." And anyway, talking about what I do, and it was great. So we were all overserved for the next couple of hours, and then we go up to the parade route, and every pipe band on the planet was marching down that street in New York City, and we saw them all. And about halfway through the parade, there's Sean Connery, the Grand Marshal of the parade, beaming ear to ear, wearing his mother's tartan and his kilt. He's a great big guy. He was 6'5". He was a Mr. Universe. There he is. And I saw Sean Connery, a fellow Scotsman, beaming from ear to ear. Well, there have been other famous Scotsmen, John Locke, who had this great idea that reason and logic should supplant the divine right of kings and superstition and myth about how human relations and civil rights should be. The Enlightenment. What an idea. Let's use reason rather than just monarchy and the divine right of kings to plot the course of human development. And one of my favorites, Sir Robert Alexander Watson Watt. In 1935, he invented the first functional radar, which came really handy 4 years later when the English had to fight the Battle of Britain against the German Luftwaffe. And due to the English ability to see what altitude and how many of those German planes were going to come over the UK, they'd sent their Spitfire and Hurricane fighters and shot them down in droves. And the Brits won the Battle of Britain due to his invention. And plus the valor of the English pilots, the ground crews that kept those planes in the air, the people who were on the ground corps trying to tell them, the whole team effort of the Royal Air Force, and the civilians, and taking terrible punishment. But Watson Watt was instrumental in creating that perfect electronic gadget that helped to win the Battle of Britain and eventually World War II. Other famous Scots, Isaac Newton, the mathematician. I have a bone to pick with him. He invented calculus, and I still can't understand it. James Watt, the steam engine. John Lister, antiseptic surgery. That's why they call it Listerine. Alexander Graham Bell, the phone. Alexander Fleming, penicillin. James Baird, the TV cooking host and a world-famous chef and writer of culinary books. James Baird had this great line, I've got to tell you. Somebody asked Mr. Baird, do you think you'd ever be you'd ever eat human flesh? You ever think you'd be a cannibal? Baird thought for a moment and says, yes, if I had enough tarragon. Well, the list goes on and on and on, and I see I've gone way over time, so I'll shut up and just say one last thing. Scotland forever! Thank you for coming. See, heresy doesn't have to be boring now, does it? Thank you for letting me go over time.
No worries. Thank you for being here. As a reminder or remembrance of your time with us, this is what we have been giving to our speakers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't know if you have a place you would pin it on there. And here's
I think I can find something appropriate.
the backing for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
I just need to know where I'm sitting.
Yeah, we'll find a seat for you for sure. Couple quick things. Our birthday lunch at Sorrento's, we need to make a choice between lasagna and chicken piccata, and there's a little card that is on the table. Sorry. So I need to have that choice if you're planning going to the birthday lunch so I can let them know. And so put your name on it, circle one, and go from there. And then all the events for October are listed. Sign-ups are out in the hallway, so make sure that you sign up for that. And let's see. If there's anything else that you need to know. Well, we had the collection for the pumpkins. Suzanne has something to share with you about all of that.
Okay, I had the pleasure yesterday of going into the H-E-B on Babcock, just north of Huebner, and buying 45 pumpkins. And as you can see, they helped us get them into the, it's on this side too, okay. You can put 45 pumpkins in a Suburban, so that is great. And I wasn't there to help them because I forgot the little stickers. As you can see, we gave each child a pumpkin and some stickers to put on it. This picture here is, well, the ones show the apartments, the duplexes for the single parents out at the Presbyterian Children's Home. The one on the, I guess it is, yeah, you're right, is actually where the transitional, that's the people who have, young adults who have aged out of foster care. And they also had have pumpkins there. Is there another picture? Okay, no, okay. Well, while they were putting them out, one young lady who is in the transitional, she took her pumpkin in. So she's ready to, decorate it. One of the mothers later told Banner, who is Banner Huggins, works out at Peach House, that she knows her kids are going to have a lot of fun this weekend doing their pumpkins, because we gave them pumpkins and about 2 or 3 sheets of stickers to put on it. I would like to say that I guess a lot of kids never had a pumpkin. And last year, Jane Blackburn and Jane Warren gave me money to buy pumpkins. And I went to an H-E-B and I bought I think 5 or 6 pumpkins, and the cashier demanded that someone help me out to the car. And this young man went out there and he says, "Why are you buying so many pumpkins?" And I told him I was taking him to Pre-Chas, and I mentioned, about the single families, and I mentioned about the young adults who had just, aged out of foster care. And he looked at me and he said, "I aged out of foster care and I never had a pumpkin." And I mean, so the pumpkins are greatly appreciated by all of them. So I thank all of you. And just let you know, this might be the easiest way to do it, is just have Banner make arrangements. And next year we might have some people help us put them out, but they do have their pumpkins now.
So I thought it'd be fun to see the results of collecting and purchasing and actually seeing pumpkins on the doorsteps. And did you say that they were the medium pumpkins? So I'd hate to see the large ones. Yeah, that they were maybe, sure, if they were medium pumpkins, the stickers would cover the whole pumpkin. So now we've transitioned from the Halloween pumpkins on the tables to Christmas. And yes, that's because we tended to not start early enough to collect for the household staff that treat us so well at every meal. So the next month, at least, maybe month and a half, we'll have those buckets out so that we can collect a gift for our household staff. And that way, we'll actually have it when it gets to be November and December. And probably that's largely because of my forgetting, but this year, remembering to get that done early. So that's why we have those Christmas buckets on the table and have them October and November so we can give a thank you gift for our household staff. Glad that you're here. And as I said, Shepherd's Pie for lunch. And let me pray, and we'll have lunch together. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for Tom. Thank you for the work that he's done over the years to make history fun and interesting. And thank you for him being with us today, and we just ask your blessing on him. And Father, thank you for the food that we will share together. Thank you for the hands that have prepared it, the hands that will serve it to us. And thank you for the fellowship that we can share together around these tables. Go before us in everything that we say and do. In Jesus' name, amen.